Hello and welcome to the Lebanese Politics Podcast. My name is Benjamin Red. I'm joined as always by Nizar Hassan. How's it going, Nizar?
Not bad. In another lockdown.
That's right. We're on day 4 of the. I guess it was supposed to be a super lockdown at first, but we're sort of back to the normal lockdown after the spike in cases last week. Today, we have a very special guest on the program, Paul Abi Nasr, who is a member of the board of the Association of Lebanese Industrialists. He is also the CEO of Polytextile, a local company that manufactures textiles. Paul, welcome to the show. We're really excited to have you, especially because we are going to be talking about industrial policy and the government's plan and what's good in it, what's bad in it, etc. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Ben and Nizar. Thank you for having me.
Great. Well, let's jump right into it. The news of the past week. I mentioned the spike in coronavirus cases last week. Well, this week has been a much better week. We had a 4-day lockdown, as I mentioned earlier, starting Thursday. Today is the last day of it because of the spike. But we haven't really seen these big increases in new case reports since last Sunday. Last Sunday was the last day of big new case reports. There were 36 that day, bringing the total to 845. Now, we're recording this on Sunday before they announced the new numbers for Sunday, so not quite a week. The number as of Saturday was 902 cases. Now, these fewer cases also came with fewer flights during the interregnum between Phase 2 and Phase 3 of the expat repatriations, which we talked about as well on the program. Phase 3 started on Thursday, the same day as the lockdown. And I'd like to just point out one thing on the spike and on the crackdown and the number of cases we've seen. That spike wasn't due to the easing measures because, it takes at least 2 weeks or so to really see a spike, and the easing measures have not been happening had not been happening for that long. And so certainly a lot of people have turned their focus to these expat flights and the danger that they pose for bringing new cases of corona, potentially different strains of corona into the country. And that is something that officials are supposedly looking at more as Phase 3 begins, and we have thousands of Lebanese, potentially some infected, coming back into the country. How to control those people once they're here and make sure that they abide by quarantine, etc. The government's going to announce whether the current lockdown is going to end, whether they're going to open up tomorrow or not. So you guys will know that more than me right now, who is speaking to you from the past. Other guidance may also come out of this meeting, of course, as well. Also in the news this week, we saw a really big push to crack down on illegal smuggling. Oil and wheat are reportedly being smuggled from Lebanon to Syria. And the reason these two things are really important is because they're basically subsidized by Banque du Liban, Lebanon's central bank. So if you want to import wheat or import oil, then BDL will give you a preferred exchange rate, the old 1507.5 exchange rate or somewhere around there. And so this week, with these reports and everything, everything really came to a head. And we see this every so often, a push from the top to sort of crack down on smuggling. The Higher Defense Council met on Wednesday and decided to crack down on illegal border crossings. The Justice Minister asked the state prosecutor to prosecute smugglers. And Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, he made a big deal about border smuggling in his speech on Wednesday. All of this stuff happened on Wednesday, I believe. And he said, border smuggling is a problem, but Lebanon can't handle it alone. It has been a problem since the establishment of Greater Lebanon, referring to September 1st, in 1920, almost 100 years ago, the creation of Greater Lebanon, which sort of separated it from Greater Syria. And basically what he did was he called for closer ties with Syria to combat this. He said, Lebanon can't do this alone. This is a problem that concerns both the Lebanese and the Syrian governments. So we should, make ties better, reestablish ties with Syria in a real substantive way so that we can work on this problem together. As far as the smuggling thing goes, though, this strikes me as one of those things that the government picks up quite often, but never quite delivers on it. Paul, I know you've got a few thoughts on this matter as well.
Well, yes, Ben. Actually, smuggling is a very old problem in Lebanon, but it was exacerbated after the Syrian war. Typically, the issue with smuggling used to be the other way around, and it still is, by the way. It's both ways. It goes at this point right now. You have oil and wheat which are going towards Syria because they are, as you said, subsidized in Lebanon. But you also have a problem which is even bigger, which is the smuggling of products through Syria to Lebanon. That's a much bigger issue because this destroys the economy completely. We estimate that we get up to 40% of the local consumption is being smuggled. Up to 40%. That's huge. We're talking about FMCG products, obviously. We're not talking about cars. We're not talking about other things like this, but products.
Fast-moving consumer goods.
Yes, fast-moving consumer goods. So this is a huge, huge number. We heard that the government saying they're going to crack down. I've been hearing them say this. I mean, every single prime minister, ever since I've been in the public sphere, been telling us, yes, we're going to crack down on smuggling, and then nothing happens. This time around, they seem to say, okay, we're going to send the army to do that. But just to remind everyone, the British army donated to the Lebanese government and to the Lebanese army outposts and watchtowers all over the border with Syria. And they have been trained, and they have scanners, and they have drones, and they have all of that. I don't get it, not even a second, the issue of we have to coordinate with Syria to bring down smuggling. The only way to bring down smuggling is to crack down on them from a point of view of border control, and then to crack down on them also on the point of view of selling the products in the market. If they send their teams to the market, they could ask for the supplier's invoice whenever they go into any shop. And if the supplier invoice is not there, then this product is smuggled and they could slap them with a heavy fine. The idea being, if you kill the demand, then there won't be a need for a supply.
How much of this is a technical problem and how much of this is just a lack of sustained political will?
As I'm saying, it's not it's not a lack of sustained political will. It's just a lack of political will altogether. There is it is a predetermined, well-designed system. It's not a byproduct of something that happens right now, because I've heard a lot of people saying this is an arbitrage because of the subsidies in Lebanon, so there is an arbitrage opportunity and people will take advantage of it. In reality, it has been going for years and years, and this is what creates companies that are completely invisible to the government. They bring in their product, they don't pay VAT, they don't pay tariffs, they don't pay taxes eventually, they're not registered anywhere, and they're destroying the rest of the economy. You cannot compete with a company that has 30% less cost than you do.
Meanwhile, cutting the state out of revenues from taxes or duties or whatever.
Exactly.
Also in the news, a high-ranking BDL official was arrested this week. Mazen Hamdan, the head of monetary operations at the central bank, was arrested on the orders of financial prosecutor Ali Ibrahim, who accused him of manipulation of the exchange rate of the dollar. I still don't quite understand all of the nuances of the charges here. Basically, the idea was that he was intervening in the currency market at a rate that sort of helped the exchange rate or helped the lira devalue.
He was selling dollars not only to Class A exchange shops, which, part of the circulars of BDL that we've talked about in the past was how BDL would choose certain exchange shops and give them and put them in its own circle of dollars, because now the big question is the control of the hard currency. So basically what I understood is that he was selling dollars to the right people and the wrong people. But basically the piece of news that was all over Lebanese media was not very explanatory at all, because all it said was that he was selling at the rate of 3,200. So the exchange shops had to sell at a higher price. Yeah, but this doesn't mean that they would sell at 4,200.
Yeah,
it doesn't really explain.
3,205 or something, and that's a decent spread in normal times, I guess. Maybe not today. We need to put this in context, though, right? Because this comes amid like a really big battle, basically between Riyad Salameh and Hassan Diab, or depending on how you look at it, the Future Movement and the FPM, some people have said, or the Future Movement and those in power in government right now. And you'll remember a couple of weeks back, there was this big blow up with Diab and Salameh trading accusations. And this seems to me like we don't really know, but it definitely seems to be sort of in the same vein. There's this tension between the government and BDL over correct policy. And increasingly, the government is less afraid to use the tools at its disposal to get what they want.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting that we haven't heard any political condemnations of the prosecution. Like BDL has denied the accusations, but we're yet to hear from any political factions because usually anyone with solid decision-making powers or jurisdiction in any public institution that gets prosecuted, you will hear some political voices defending them. So that's interesting. I don't know if Mazen Hamdan is not related to any political force, or that they are, taking a step back in this situation, or he might be, the fall guy of someone else. I don't know enough about the story, but it's interesting that it hasn't been politicized yet.
Speaking of prosecuting civil servants, we were talking about the fuel scandal last week. Well, we have more developments this week. First off, Algeria has denied any responsibility, although the president's spokesman has said that the justice minister has been asked to open an investigation. But here in Lebanon, domestically, also, we have the judiciary summoning, I guess, the head of oil installations here in Lebanon, a man by the name of Sarkis Halais, and he is not complying. Marada leader Slimane Frangieh, the former minister, the former MP, the head of the Marada party, he came out on Monday and just gave a very fiery speech, said that Halais would not turn himself into the current judiciary, which he called politicized and biased in favor of Gibran Bassil. So Frangieh is basically saying no to this entire process, which he thinks is just something that it is sort of trumped up against one of his guys who is in the ministry. And of course, you have the larger thing that's going on here as well, which is that both Bassil and Frangieh are looking to become president. Both of them want to become president in 2022 when Aoun's term ends. And these guys, they are neighbors basically up in the north. Bassil's base is in Batroun, which is, just southwest of Zakarta, which is the home, the ancestral home of Slimane Frangieh. And both these guys, I mean, we've talked about this before on the program, right, Nizar? They're both going for the presidency. And so their relations have been strained really, really far. And especially under the current circumstances and the current pressures, their relationship has become, I think, even worse than before, if that's possible.
Yeah. I mean, it can't get any more escalated than this, and Aoun is still there. Like, you hear Slimane Frangieh in the press conference just explicitly and directly talking about the presidential race and talking about himself versus Gibran Bassil. So it's things are usually more subtle in Lebanese politics, but there is this thing where Frangieh needs to always bring himself up. He needs to reassure his relevance in the political sphere. He can't be a marginal figure and be president at this time of Lebanon's history, because this is not the time of marginal presidents. This is the time of, more politically involved presidents. And he's someone who's very close to the Syrian regime historically. We've talked about the Frangieh family at many instances during this podcast. But what's definitely true is that, he's been one of the most loyal people to the Assad family. So this helps him a lot because, as we talked, after the end of the elections, the Syrian regime has a lot of influence now on the Lebanese parliament, on basically on government in Lebanon in general. But basically, in terms of representation in parliament, there's a very big portion of MPs who come from backgrounds that are sympathetic or close or allied with the Syrian regime. So it's now about who basically the Syrian regime and other forces, obviously, like Hezbollah and the Berri, etc., but who they agree on to be the next president. And Frangieh is hoping that because Bassil is widely disliked by most political forces, as well as by most people, to be clear, that he would have the upper hand in that. We'll see about that, yeah. But that's his main bet, I think.
Everybody else is talking about the U.S. presidential election this year. We're talking about the Lebanese presidential election 2 years from now. Yeah. Strap in. We're going to have a lot more to say about this over the next couple of years. Very quickly, the Lira has actually gone up against the dollar in the past couple of days. The rate right now is 36.50 to 37.50 Lira to the dollar, according to LiraRate.com. However, I have a lot of questions about this. I don't know if it's possible to buy dollars at this rate. I've definitely heard of instances where people couldn't even buy dollars for like 42.50. So, unless you're actually able to both buy and sell dollars around this rate, then it's not the real rate, right? And so I think we're going to have to wait a little bit longer to see whether this is just like sort of a blip, whether this is some sort of cash grab on someone's part, or whether this actually is the lira sort of settling down against the dollar a little bit. Also this week, the other big item that we have to talk about quickly is the IMF is in town. The government began to hold their negotiations with an IMF delegation this week. Finance Minister Ghazi Wazni said that Lebanon is ready to float the lira, but only after receiving external support. They're requesting about $9 billion from the IMF, he said. And once we start receiving that, then Lebanon is ready to move to, first off, a period of a flexible exchange rate before a full flotation, is what he said. He also said that the number of banks is likely to be cut in half as the banking sector consolidates and reforms itself. And he also said that Parliament is finally going to pass a capital controls bill, which I don't know. It's one of those things that I've heard this before, and we'll see if it actually happens this time. But promises don't really count for too much here.
Yeah, I mean, the capital controls bill, which, just suddenly disappeared from the government's agenda after Nabih Berri announced that it's dead, and, other things related to restructuring the banking sector and making it much smaller or cutting it in half are parts of the government plan, and they are basically parts that cannot be, they are not like optional things. They are some of the main pillars of the plan, without which, it wouldn't work. And given this plan today, and we talked about the plan a lot in the episode where we analyzed it, but one of the things we said about it is that, it's very heavy on financial issues and specific sectors or specific matters. They are very well written, very well elaborated, but not so much on other things, right? And when we talked about how it deals with the sectors and the issue of economic development and what kind of economic development we want in the various sectors, it's very light. Basically, all the sectors are put in an annex. And, there is, on the industrial sector, for example, which is the main topic for this episode, there's only about, 300 words of material. It's basically nothing, just big headlines without any details whatsoever. So, Paul, you're here with us to discuss the industrial sector in Lebanon. And in light of this government plan, do you, was this also your feeling? We will talk about the plan in 5 or 10 minutes, but was this also your feeling that, it was quite marginalized in this whole recovery plan?
I think that was extremely underwhelming. It showed that this is not the target of the plan. As I have said it before multiple times already, this is a bankruptcy proceeding. It's not a recovery plan. It has nothing to do with an economic vision. As you pointed out, they're putting 300 words on industrial sector that supposedly should have been their main target or their main pillar going forward. At least that's what they are saying. And you put 300 words in an annex about it in a 55-page document. Just if you look at the form, you understand that it is not a plan. It was just, and you can see as well that the first section of the plan has been written by someone, and the second section, which is the economic part, has been written by a completely different group. Mm-hmm. It's not the same quality of writing. It's not the same way you propose things. And it shows it's two different groups, and it's really underwhelming, especially that there is actually a plan, an industrial plan in the Ministry of Industry that is very much along the lines of what we as an association have proposed, and it was completely sidelined for these 300 words.
We'll talk about that in a second, but first of all, let's start from the big picture, right? The industrial sector in Lebanon is known to be, it's always talked about as if it has potential, and it's true in my opinion as well as it is in yours, but it's been doing really bad over the last, say, at least 25, 30 years after the civil war. In the times of peace after the civil war, it hasn't prospered like other sectors. And the succeeding governments have been blamed for their policies or their lack of policies thereof of basically approaching the industrial sector or envisioning development of the industrial sector. Can you give us like a big picture of how the industrial sector has been doing and why we reached the point where it has deteriorated and became a smaller size relative to the size of the economy?
Well, yes, of course. If we go back a bit to the mid 1990s, the industrial sector was relatively bigger and in a much better shape. In 2000, the tariffs, the main tariffs were brought down from 40% to an abysmal 5% on average. And this typically decimated overnight a big part of the industrial base, because obviously this is an industrial base that was just going out of a civil war, and it was not ready for international competition. We were supposed to have programs in place by the EU to be able to help us smooth our way into a better manufacturing base to be able to eventually export to the EU. That obviously never materialized. We had some spotty programs here and there, but this wasn't anything with an economic vision. Not to go too deep into the history of things, but typically in the last, let's say, if you go back only a couple of years backwards, so that would be around 2013, 14, we were still exporting $4.7 billion a year. Then the Syrian roads were closed, so everything exporting through Syria was shut down, and we lost overnight around 1.5 to 1.8 billion of exports, which are extremely important, especially if we see in the backdrop of what's happening right now and the lack of the hard currency in the country. So typically across, all these years, since 2000 till today, no economic vision whatsoever, no plans for the industrial sector, no bold solutions, no just straddling along. And also never, the big issue as well is that when you have the Ministry of Industry and the Ministry of Economy being completely separate one from the other, the Ministry of Economy does the trade deals, so they negotiate the trade deals. And if you look at every single trade deal that we've done with any country in the world, all of them we're losing, all of them, literally. Unless you have the Ministry of Industry, manufacturing associations like ours on the table negotiating, because we know what is needed in the country. We know what could damage us and what, on the other hand, could provide us with an opportunity to export. So every single country we signed a deal with actually ends up abusing this system. Even the Taysir al-Arabi, which is the free trade agreement with the Arab countries, for those countries that we are interested in exporting to, like the Maghrib Arabi, which is Morocco, Tunis, Algeria, they simply disregard the deal. They signed it, but they disregarded it. And we're always in a bad position in negotiation. So this is pretty much where we're at right now. At this point, at least in 2019, or just before the revolution, we were around 13% of GDP, and that's around we were around 10 billion of output a year, 160,000 employees, and 2.7 billion of exports. So this is pretty much it in a nutshell where we're at right now.
My question would be now, in this crisis, what impact are you seeing on the manufacturing sector? Because some people say that, compared to other sectors, it doesn't do as bad during this time, except for manufacturing that heavily depends on imported raw materials. What is your assessment of kind of the impact of the crisis right now, the economic crisis in Lebanon and the lockdown resulting from the pandemic on the industrial sector?
As you pointed out, normally the manufacturing sector should not be as affected by the currency issue and the hard currency issue, because if you look at the whole sector, on average, you need around 30 to 35% of your cost in raw material, which means that if you compare it with a finished product, you're reducing your hard currency bill by at least threefolds. Now, on the other hand, the hard currency is being hard to find actually in the market. And while we talked to the government and we got a approval, or let's say a pledge from them that they were going to inject $300 million as a bridge loan to the manufacturing sector in hard currency. So typically they would allow us to use our own dollars, our dollars in that case, in the bank to be able to procure some raw material. This never materialized. Then we went to 100 million. So they went down from 300 million to 100 million. And at this point, we're working to see how we can actually manage to get the 100 million to be able to give this push for the industrial sector. So the main issue is still, yes, raw material, getting raw material. Some industrial sectors are actually more affected than others. Those, as you pointed out, that have a higher level of raw material usage. But in general, again, we're missing an opportunity at this point, because if we go heavily, by helping heavily the manufacturing sector, we would reduce our import bill quite substantially.
Yeah, we will be talking about like the problems with or the lack of enthusiasm about the sector in the plan in a second. But like as you're saying, it's really if we look at the Lebanese economy from like if we zoom out, we see that from all sectors that have been funding the Lebanese economy and local consumption, bringing in the dollars into the economy, very few are solid enough to be sustained during crisis. Right, most of them are volatile. Remittances, foreign investments, these things are really volatile, especially deposits in banking sector. And when you have a confidence crisis, then basically you won't get any of that. So one of the few sectors that can save you in this situation is either the industry or agriculture, because you're exporting things consistently and bringing back dollars to the economy. So really, if you go back to any of our early episodes about the problems of the Lebanese economy before this whole explosion happened and the whole deterioration of the lira, we were always saying the big problem is the problem of the shortage of dollars. And you can't resolve the shortage of dollars on the long term without empowering the sectors that can help you export things. Let's, I think, get into the government plan in a bit more detail. Can you tell us, Paul, why you were saying that it doesn't meet the requirements, it doesn't take the industrial sector seriously? And if anyone is reviewing the plan, it's one of the annexes, so you have to scroll down to the end of it and find it, along with agriculture and other industries, sectors down there.
It's 42 and 43 on the long document.
Well, yeah, it's 42 and just one part of 43, not even 2 pages.
Exactly.
What I would like to say about the government plan, and I think it's important to look at it as a whole, because there is no such a thing as a plan that is, it tackles a certain problem or certain part of the economy, and we cannot take it piecemeal. This has to be an overarching approach. That gives a new vision for the country, creates a something to look up to, or to look up for. I mean, this is extremely important. If you look at the first part of the document, you'll see that they are expecting GDP to reach 34 billion in 2024. It's like we'll be back at 55 billion in 40 years or so. And it, in my opinion, it's totally ridiculous. We cannot just put under conservative, or let's say simply ridiculous growth rate targets, especially when we say that the country will devaluate or will de facto have a reduced GDP up to 28 billion. So you're starting from rock bottom. You cannot have, 1%, 1.5% growth targets as if you were the United States or Europe. You should be targeting 12, 13, 14% with bold programs to jumpstart the economy. You want a V-shaped recovery. You cannot have, a protracted, long recovery. This will be unsustainable. Neither for socially, it will be unsustainable. And all the story about the nets and social nets are they will not be enough. So just to start from there, you see that it's as if the whole plan is a bankruptcy proceeding. It's like, okay, we have the losses. This is how we're going to distribute the losses. This is how we're going to make the balance sheet, balanced again somehow. And what would that do to the economy? It probably will destroy the economy, but we have nothing else to do with it. We're forced to do that. And I'm totally against it. And I think it's completely wrong. And I think that we should have had 55 pages of economic solutions and an economic recovery plan, and only maybe 2 or 3 pages discussing the financial issues. Because in reality, they are basing their financial restructuring on a picture of what's going on today. And they're not looking at it in the mindset of an economic recovery. I'm not saying, be very rosy in the way you're approaching things, or even be delusional about it. But if we're not looking at the last decade or even at the last 20 years coming forward, we need to have a proper plan, a proper vision that will literally give this feeling of actually accepting the losses that are currently now, and accepting probably the hardship that are going to come in the next year or two, because there is going to be a recovery at the end. But if you're saying from now that you need 5 years to recover just 3-4% of your GDP, then what you're going to end up with is simply a big explosion on the social level. So that's just as a total overview. But if I look at the industrial sector, I mean, what they've presented in the plan. First of all, they looked at all the sectors, like the industrial sector, the agriculture sector, and they're practically copy pasted one to the other. And they also have a lot of errors in it. They talk about the availability of highly skilled labor. That's not true. That's one of the issues that we're trying to fix. They talk about the raw material financing, and they came across the 750 million support of raw material. Just so that everyone understand, this is the Cedar Oxygen Fund, and this has nothing to do with the government. This is a private initiative done by wonderful people. Alexandre Harouz, Jean Salome, they are leading this initiative in Luxembourg, and they've given of their time. They're part of the LIFE, which is the group of financial executives in the world, Lebanese financial executives in the world. And this is a completely private initiative to try and help the raw material issue in Lebanon. And seeing the government use that in their plan as if it was theirs is just incredible.
Basically, the government doesn't have a lot to say about its own kind of investment in the sector and support for the sector. So it's borrowing from initiatives happening by private actors.
Yes, and it's incredible because they didn't even talk to them about it. I know firsthand that they heard about it on the news, that they're saying they're going to give support for raw material and so forth. Anyways, we can see it's just a ragtag of a couple of things, that they've written, providing reduction in SF fees, subsidized loan. I don't know from where they're going to get the money for subsidized loans. If you plug that into the initial financial plan, you see that it doesn't exist. So they say they're going to give subsidized loan, but they don't allocate the funds in it inside the financial plan. So typically, it's as if they're writing this annex just to say, you know what, this is also an economic plan, when in reality, it's none of that. It's just a restructuring plan that's typically saying, you know what, the banks were bad, the BDL was bad, they used up all the money, we're going to make them pay for that, and that's about it. And once we do that, then we'll have a clean slate and we'll start over again. It's completely wrong, and I think that it is, on an economic level, it's underwhelming. On a financial level, it's going to destroy the economy, and they have to redo it again, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the action plan here, and these subsidized loans and guarantees and everything, like that's sort of the big fist, like that's the big punch here, and it isn't even. We have got lots of questions about where that money is even going to come from. But then the other things on the list, like you were talking about, like these tax breaks and developing industrial zones, establish a proudly made in Lebanon brand, and all of this stuff, increasing standards. All of these other things are things that have been proposed in the past, right?
Yes, obviously, but the problem is, let's take them one at a time. If we talk about the Made in Lebanon brand, as an association, that's what we're doing. That's not the government's job. They're not doing it. They never did it, and that's what we're doing as an association.
And we already have that. I mean, I see Made in Lebanon on products.
Yeah, what you see on products at this point is just Made in Lebanon, which is required by law. But what we're trying to achieve is pretty much what the Swiss have done, what the Italian have done, French have done as well. The idea of having this Made in Lebanon becoming a quality label and not just a label that's telling you from where the product comes from. And this is important. And it will need investments over a long period of time. It will need enforcing quality standards across sectors, because yes, in Lebanon, we have some very, very, very good manufacturers, but we also have some bad ones. And the issue is that the government doesn't enforce quality. And so when it does not enforce quality, if one apple is rotten, you have the whole box that's going to go bad.
Right. So if all these things have been proposed before, why haven't they happened?
Because typically, if you look at all of these things, it requires, again, an economic vision, a plan, a long-term plan, where you have consecutive ministers who come in and don't scrap this plan and start over, which is exactly what happens in Lebanon. I've seen already 3 ministers. Since I've been on the board of directors of the association, and every new minister comes in, gets his team in, scraps the old plan, look at what's already there, picks something from it that he feels is going to be, the most, let's say, that will show the most how much he wants to get something done, and go for it. And obviously, if you run a company like this, the company goes bankrupt in a year or two. And this is exactly what happened with the industrial sector right here. I know that the ministry is doing a lot of work. The The director of the general director of the ministry is doing great work. All the employees, they're trying. But this needs something much bigger. This needs literally a vision. Someone coming in and saying, you know what? I want to produce electric cars in Lebanon. How am I going to do that? I need to create industrial zones. Perfect. What have we done till now, and why was it wrong? They've proposed industrial zones in so remote areas. I mean, the areas are so remote that it's going to be impossible with the infrastructure of Lebanon for any industrialist to relocate there. It'd be impossible. If I want to relocate my manufacturing facilities to any of those proposed industrial zones, I'll have to drive every day 2.5 hours to reach them. And it's simply unfeasible. So instead of that, we should have a clear approach by saying, if we want to do let's say, industrial machinery, we want to build industrial machinery in the country, we want to build electric cars in the country, what do we do? Where do we create our industrial zone? What kind of facilities are we going to have to invest in to attract this kind of talent? Not only financial. The issue is not only financial. It's also ease of use, what kind of, let's say, close proximity to ports, proximity to living quarters, and so forth. So when you start thinking this way, and you say, okay, I need an agro-food industrial zone, specialized. So what do I need to make it happen? I'll need to invest in a laboratory and plant it there. I need to invest maybe in some technical schools and plant it there. And then I will be able to see some clusters being created. And the manufacturing sector will start becoming clusterized in a way that creates efficiencies and creates synergies. So this is what's required, not just lip service about, we're going to increase the brand of Made in Lebanon, the quality label, or we're just going to invest in some industrial sector. All of this just without details, without a proper vision. What kind of industrial sector we expect in Lebanon? Do we want to produce steel? Do we want to produce plastics? Do we want to produce textiles? What is it exactly that we feel is good for the country and would do well also to compete with other countries? We have to look at what our diaspora needs. We have a huge diaspora of around 14 to 15 million. I mean, this is a market in of itself. Did we look at what are they buying? What are they importing when they are living in Nigeria, when they're living in France, when they're living in the US? What are they consuming? How can we reach them? So this is the kind of approach. You get all of this information, you put them in a plan, and then you can proceed.
Speaking of the role of the industrial sector and its development, I would actually bring up this point that I hear a lot. A lot of people always say Lebanon doesn't have the capacity to be industrial power, so we shouldn't waste time there, or we shouldn't have illusions that we will be competing with other countries. This perspective definitely lacks nuance, because a lot of industrial development now is about specialization and development of the specific industries that you have competitive advantage in, and that you can learn from other close industries in order to develop. So it's more about specialization and knowing exactly what industries you want, rather than saying, I want to be an industrial power in general. And arguably, it's been like that throughout history. There have been very few cases where, one country would be, except for China probably, one country would be very good or the best at producing so many things, right? So what is your perspective on that? What kind of vision or industrial potential do you see for Lebanon? Because you've been talking about what we need instead of this plan, like what kind of policies we need. So my first question is, what role you see or what potential you see for Lebanon industrially? And the second question is, isn't it all about the allocation of funds? Like, if we get the best minister of industry that we can think of, like the best guy with the best vision, the best guy or woman, of course, with the best vision, who will come and do an upheaval in the ministry and everything, can they do anything without a very serious change of paradigm in terms of budget allocations?
Well, first of all, I think that one of the issues with the perception of Lebanon not being able to compete is the distortion created by the peg. When the peg was actually created, gradually it created this false, false purchase power in Lebanon that made manufacturing in the country completely uncompetitive, because you could import anything and that would not be affected by the currency cost. And therefore, it would be as if you were fighting or you were competing without the actual structure, economic structure of the country affecting it. Let me give you a simple example. If I want to produce glass bottles, producing them in Lebanon will be more expensive than producing them anywhere else. Because, I mean, not now, but usually, because now it's subsidized, the energy is subsidized, but let's say, and it won't stay that way, but let's say in normal cases, our energy cost is relatively high. So it doesn't make too much sense to produce them if we're competing just like that, straight from the point and saying, okay, I want to produce in Lebanon or I want to produce in Egypt, for example. But then you bring in the currency and you say that, oh, wait a second, $200 million worth of glass bottles that are being imported every year to Lebanon. If you're producing them in-house in Lebanon, then you're reducing your import bill by 150 million. Then it changes everything. So the point is, and it will affect, obviously, the currency. So when you float the currency, these questions of whether we build a manufacturing plant for glass bottles in the country or not is not anymore just a matter of producing the dollar cost, a certain dollar cost. What the peg did is that it distorted completely this reality. So we had two major glass bottles manufacturing facilities in Lebanon. One was bombed in 2006. The other one closed shop, I think, a year ago or so, and investing in a new one, unless you are sure that you're going to be protected, is a big deal. It's $50-60 million to start with for a small plant, and then you go all the way to $100 million to do that. But the point is, not everything should be looked at from the point of view of just the exact cost, comparing it to competing with a company in China or in Bangladesh. On the other hand, we have a lot of things that we can compete on. First of all, we should be thinking about how to provide nearshoring capability to Europe. And this is a very important concept. Throughout the 2000s, all the way till now, the main drive was to outsource. Outsource to India, outsource to China, outsource to Bangladesh, outsource to Myanmar, and so forth. Today, the approach is being changed. It's being changed to something called nearshoring. Nearshoring being the proximity and the speed to actually provide products on time, on the shelves, means that you don't need to buy products too early and to stock them up too early. And Lebanon is very well poised in that scheme, because what you can do is that you can produce multiple items, short runs. You don't need to produce huge quantities. Provide them by boat to Europe. It should take you 6 to 7 days by boat to get to Europe. So you can get products on the shelves extremely fast. Compare that with China, and you have a cycle of around between 8 and 12 months. So we could be looking at cycles of a month to month in Lebanon compared to 12 months in China. And the Europeans will be more than happy to pay a premium for that, because they would reduce their cost of stocking and warehousing, and they'll be much more reactive on the market. So if you want to look at this, I'll give you a couple of examples that are really interesting. The machine building capability. People don't know that, but there are companies in Lebanon that are producing a warehousing robot for BMW. You have companies producing production lines for P&G, Procter & Gamble. You can also produce high-end products. You can also produce high-added value products. And we're really well poised for that, because we have a good white-collar workforce. We need to work on our blue-collar one, that's for sure. But our white-collar is really good. So we can actually produce multiple items, multiple products, switch from one to the other, which is a big hassle when it comes to big producers in China or in Egypt.
Okay, so you're talking about things that we can export. Earlier, though, you were talking about industry itself, and it sounded to me like you were saying that not only do we need to support local industry and specific industries where we have a competitive advantage, whether that be through tax breaks or loans or whatever, or guarantees, but also, do we need higher tariffs? Do we need more protection then?
In my opinion, yes, we need targeted tariffs, and that's very important. Some countries actually dump their products. We had, in the association, we fought our way to establishing, I think, 19 or 20 different sectors, which we identified as being dumped in the country. And we got, after wrangling for probably 3 years, we got a tariff protection for those. They haven't been yet put in place because of all the crisis and everything. But the point is, we identified that 20 major sectors were being dumped in Lebanon. So you had an issue like, for instance, Persil, which is Henkel. Well, we have a production facility for Henkel in Lebanon. And in the same time, products were being dumped from Henkel Turkey into Henkel Lebanon. And that's the same company. So whenever Turkey, let's say, had an issue with their own currency and they need to export more, the government would come in and subsidize their exports. And so they'll become so cheap and they will be dumped in Lebanon. So we needed to make sure that we create anti-dumping laws. Tariffs per se are important. They are important because you need to make sure that every company is fighting on the same level. A company in Lebanon cannot fight with a company that's subsidized in Saudi Arabia. It cannot compete with a company that's heavily subsidized in Iran. It cannot compete with a company subsidized in Turkey. So we need to make sure that all the countries that subsidize their production, we need to put tariffs there. I'm not saying just slap tariffs across the board without being targeted. It should be targeted cases. We need to make sure that it only targets the section that puts all the competition on fair grounds. But in the same time, it's important just to make sure that people will keep investing in the industrial sector. I also proposed something called the potential tariff increase, which is instead of adding the tariffs right now, you could say, okay, if someone comes in and invests in this particular sector, we'll protect him with, let's say, 10% tariffs or 15% tariffs. And then there is another issue with the tariff code. I'm not sure that we have the time to discuss it now, but there is a big issue with the tariff code right now. The code itself, not just the levels or the tariffs themselves, but the code. The customs code is being used and abused, whereby the majority of the imports that are coming in under some part of the tariff code, which is called others. So in every different sector, they import them under others. And so you don't even know what's being imported, and they're without any customs whatsoever.
Yeah, got you. And in your opinion, does the ministry, I guess the ministries of economy and industry, do they have the capacity to tackle all of these problems, whether that's, tracking which states are funding or subsidizing certain industries or certain companies, and just the ability to come up with an overall plan for targeted tariffs and increasing vigilance there? Does the government have the capacity to do that?
Well, we've been working with them. The question is not the capacity, it's the will, because try to get them information from the customs department. It's horrendous. You just can't do that. You have to go through the president of the country to do that. And it's unacceptable. Reality is they know that the tariff code is wrong and they know it should be fixed. And it doesn't need to be too complicated to fix it, because the schemes are in place, the laws are in place. You can just use them and it will work. The issue was, until now at least, it was on purpose, done on purpose. And that's a very big issue. The idea was simply that, there are people taking advantage of it, and they're politically related. And so we're not going to touch them. If they want to actually do it, then we as an association have tried to help, and we will keep trying to help, and we will help. But the point is, it can be done. Yes, it can be done. Definitely can be done. I don't like to talk about subsidizing because it's something that I hate, and I don't think we should ever propose subsidizing anything. What I propose, on the other hand, when it comes to what the government should do, it should create schemes to make it more interesting for foreign direct investments to come in, not subsidizing any sector whatsoever. If you want to protect the sector, you can increase the tariffs a bit, but don't subsidize the sector, because this automatically creates arbitrage opportunities and it will be corrupt. On the other hand, you make sure that you protect the sectors that need protecting. Some of those are connected to, let's say, the food safety or environmental safety. So you don't need to make too much money on everything, but sometimes you need it in the sector, let's say in the economy itself, and because you need an ecosystem. Something very important is that when you want the companies to export, there are no companies in the world, no manufacturing sector in the world that's being built from the ground up for export. You create the companies, or you create the manufacturing companies, and you first sell in the local market, and then you're good enough, or you have in critical mass, critical size to be able to start exporting, because you want to export at an acceptable cost. And to do that, you need to have critical mass. This is only feasible if you do it. First, you sell the local market, and then you go out and sell and you export. So this is why you need to make sure your companies are not dumped on, because 1 year of dumping will simply destroy the company.
It's clear from what you're saying that there's so much to discuss about trade policies when it comes to its impact on the industrial sector, because it seems to be one of the most important things you can do, develop infrastructure and then and have the sound trade policies for it. But we can't, unfortunately, go into much more detail. We have to wrap up this episode. Thank you so much, Paul, for making it to this episode and for all the insights you've been providing. We will probably have sometimes in the future another episode about the industrial sector, but I think this gave a solid overview for listeners. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. I mean, it was a pleasure, and thank you for this really nice podcast.
And that's it for us this week. We will be back next week with another episode. Until then, I'm Benjamin Red.
I'm Nizar Hassan.
And I am Paul Abi Nasr.
And this has been the Lebanese Politics Podcast.
The Lebanese Politics Podcast is brought to you by myself, Nizar Hassan, Benjamin Red, produced behind the scenes by Susan Wilson, and the music is by Omar El Fil.